So, Andy, you write about the post-war Nazi trials as an opportunity for the Allies not just to punish, but to establish the truth and historical record of what happened. Can you talk a little bit about that and what the motivation was for looking for the Nazis and putting them on trial?
Sure, but first of all, thank you. Thanks to the OPC, and I also ought to say, one personal note. I was thinking as I was walking over here about when you became foreign editor. I was in Berlin, and of course, a lot of these issues we were writing about together, and you were editing, I was writing, and so here's this new foreign editor, and she comes over to Germany, and at that point, Gerhard Schroeder was just going to become chancellor, and I can't remember whether he just become chancellor or whether
he was on his way,
and we went to interview him together, and so I had the standard questions about, we talked about foreign policy, domestic policy. And then, I thought I knew what to anticipate from an editor at Newsweek. And you said your last assignment for me as you were leaving was saying, Schroeder has had 4 wives. He has no kids. You have to find out about his sperm count. Then I knew Deirdre was a somewhat unconventional editor.
She's been working for People magazine this week.
That guy did turn out to be a playboy, didn't he?
Oh, yes. The child of the 60s never grew up.
Right.
But anyway, to the more serious question, the trials, the purpose of the trials, and it comes up particularly now. We're at this stage where these are clearly the last of the trials for evident biological reasons. That 70 years after the war, anybody who was 20 years old at the end of the war is now at least 90. So these are the last of the perpetrators, last time many of the survivors can testify. And I think it magnifies the importance of these trials, and because they were always seen not just as punishment. Of course, the instinct at the end of the war was to punish. And when Churchill and Roosevelt were talking about trials, Stalin at one point said, "Why, I've got another form of justice we could administer. We can take out 50,000 or 100,000 top commanders and just shoot them." Churchill was a little horrified by that. But the idea was really unprecedented. Because in past wars, what would happen was people would, the victors would exact vengeance. They'd kill however many people they expected, they thought was reasonable, and they raped, pillaged, and so forth. And some of that happened in World War II, of course, at the end, particularly with the Red Army. But the notion that you are actually going to set up due process, and even if in some cases it was pretty clear what was going to happen, that the defendants, even the worst defendants, would have defense attorneys, and that there would be documentation. There would be witnesses in some trials, more in one or the other, and there would often be film footage, for instance, of the liberation of the camps, with all those horrifying footage. And it was, to a large extent, to do what President Truman later said was to make sure that in years to come, no one can say, this didn't really happen. And we think that's obvious now. But at the end of the war, while all sorts of people had seen parts of the horror, very few people had an idea of the extent of it. And the extent of the Holocaust, the extent of the other mass killings. And it wasn't self-evident that there would be this whole process of learning from the past, of treating this as not just another bloody war. This is not just normal warfare, but it is something. World War II and the Holocaust was very different. And so, right from the beginning, for instance, the Justice Jackson, who was the head of the U.S. prosecution team in Nuremberg, allowed cameras to come because he wanted to get footage of those trials to put together, to show the German people, but to the whole world, why did we fight this war? And what does Germany have to do, and Germany, Austria, and much of Europe have to come to terms with right now. So that role is really important. And in some cases, some of the people I write about, these Nazi hunters, were more interested in getting things on the record than in really what the punishment was. And that's certainly true in the trials today, because with these older defendants, in most cases, they may not serve real prison time, even if they are sentenced, but it's important that they be sentenced, that it's clear what the crimes were.
Very interestingly in the book, you discuss how the Cold War affected the hunt for the Nazis. In the beginning, the Americans had sort of a high degree of enthusiasm for putting these guys on trial. They launched Nuremberg trials, but that dissipated over the next few years as the Cold War really heated up, so to speak, with Russia. Can you talk about what effect that had on the Nazi hunting?
Yeah, it had a huge effect. And I, for instance, I tracked down a guy here in New York whose name is Peter Sikel. He came from a German Jewish family in the 1930s, and he was still in school, and his parents shipped him out, had the good wisdom to ship him out to Britain for schooling. He ended up coming to the U.S., joined the U.S. Army, and comes back as a young officer, and then joins the OSS, the forerunner of the CIA, and he runs the first CIA base in Berlin. And as someone coming from a German Jewish family, I asked him how did he feel about the fact that so quickly the shift was to the Cold War and this whole business of Nazi hunting, at least at the official level, was being discarded. And really there was a policy of what I call historical amnesia, deliberate amnesia. And because the United States wanted Germany on his side in the Cold War, and Germans were not enthused about the trials, obviously. The Soviets wanted in the Eastern Bloc, East Germany on its side. And Sichel said to me, look, I felt, there have been the trials in Nuremberg and Dachau, and they got some of the top guys. No one in my shop, nor me personally, was interested in fighting the last war. We had too many things to worry about. We were trying to protect German scientists, make sure they didn't fall in the hands of the Russians, that we got them instead. There were all these considerations. So this is one of the real dramas that I try to bring home in the book, is that the people I write about are mostly people who decided, no, we're going to fight this trend. It could have very easily, now we think we all know about the Holocaust, genocide, the crime, the extent of the crimes. If the official position had been left alone and there hadn't been individuals in governments and outside of governments who really pushed this and made people confront this again, I think our whole understanding of what happened in this period would be far more limited and really pretty myopic.
Wow, that's interesting. There were a lot of myths that grew up around the Nazi hunters. I think Hollywood is responsible for some. There was a lot of attention paid to Israel and its role in hunting former Nazis. How much of the Nazi hunter motif is kind of overblown?
Yeah, well, I mean, it was tremendously overblown, and the motif of The Boys from Brazil, some of you remember that movie. It was a wonderful movie, but had very little to do with reality. Steven Wiesenthal, who is the character hunting Mengele and confronting, wrestling him and the Doberman Pinschers.
Right.
I knew Wiesenthal well. I met him many times, and in a way he kind of enjoyed that myth, but it was myth. The idea that Israelis were searching all over the world all the time for Nazis was a myth. The Eichmann case in 1960 was the exception. And this really came home to me. For this book, I went to France, Germany, Poland, and Israel. And one of the things I had no idea when I started this project, it hadn't occurred to me, that the two top operatives, field commanders for the Eichmann operation, who physically snatched Eichmann, were still alive. And they were in their late 80s. One has died since then. But the guy who was the head of the team, Rafi Eitan, a famous Mossad agent, so I met him, and we're starting to talk, and at a certain point he says, I went to Germany for the first time in my life in 1953. I set foot there. I was a young Mossad agent. I set foot in Frankfurt, And I'm thinking, he's going after Nazis. He must be going after Nazis. He says, no, it's not what you're thinking. In fact, I was there to meet with our Mossad agents from all over Eastern Europe, the Eastern Bloc, because at that point, of course, there was an influx of Jews from Eastern Europe, from the Soviet Union, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, going to Israel. And Israel needed these people. It was still a very young, insecure state, and it needed people. But the Mossad knew that some of these people had been turned by the KGB or the other security services in Eastern Europe, and they would be infiltrated into Israel, and they would be reporting back to essentially to Moscow, whether directly or indirectly, and Moscow would be immediately conveying the information to the Arab side, its allies. So, and he said, look, at that point, Israel and the Mossad did not have the resources to be able to go after Nazis in any meaningful way. And it was only later in the 50s when Israel was beginning to feel more secure, and also they got this amazing tip from a German prosecutor who was from a secular Jewish family, who I profiled, Fritz Bauer, that they decided they could try to mount an operation. But then it was one operation. They went and tried to go for Mengele 2, but they were called off very quickly, again preoccupied. But one of the real fun parts of the myths was that a lot of the Nazis who were hiding believed those myths. Mm-hmm. And even someone like Mengele who got away, recent documents have shown that he was writing, you know, they're on my trail. You know, I'm you know, they're around the corner, and he lived as inconspicuously as possible. And so maybe there was a little poetic justice.
Yes,
there.
exactly.